What's up, Matt?
Not much. How are you?
Good, man. I don't know where this conversation will go, but I do know that whenever I listen to audio on podcasts, that quite often you'll hear people say, "Pull that sucker up to your face." So I'm going to try to make sure that we get good audio in the studio. I want to have a conversation about educational philosophy with you.
Sure.
With sort of what I teach and what you teach, weaving throughout. We didn't script any of this, so I'm kind of coming into this going, I don't know where it's going to go. So
Neither
you're
do
an
I.
interesting dude, so I'd
Yeah.
love to pick your brain about some stuff. On the very first day of class, I asked students how they ended up in my class. What are they doing here? Just the very
Mhm.
I've been asking the same question for 10 years, and the reason that I asked the question is when I was at Texas Tech in 2006. I was sort of had my arm twisted to be a TA. I just wanted to go to grad school. I didn't really want to be a TA, and it was because I was super intimidated about being in front of a group of college students at 26. I
Sure.
felt like I was a chapter ahead.
Wow, you end up as a speech professor.
Well, yeah, and we can get into the misnomer there, but I remember it was odd because I was terrified, and that was actually I think what led me into it. I always
Yeah.
liked facing fears. It seemed like a really it was an adrenaline dump for sure.
Sure.
But I remember the reason I bring that up is I got there at 4 in the morning, literally, set all the chairs up perfectly. I had my script, everything, all the things you're not supposed to do, really. Just freak yourself out about it. And I remember at 7:55, class starts at 8. I went into the graduate professor's office. It was our mentor, and I had washed my face a million times, and I'd basically almost vomited all over myself. And I was like, dude, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't walk in there right now. I walked by, and everybody was sitting there like children of the corn style, looking straight ahead. And I said, I don't know what to do. Will you take over for me? I'll do it tomorrow. And he goes, no. And he said, feel this. He said, feel it. He's the only time you'll ever feel this with respect to teaching your first class. You may feel this type of nervousness for something else, but feel it. And he goes, it means you care, right? And it may have meant that I cared, but it also meant that I was just freaked out. And he said, let me give you a piece of advice on the way out. He said, just ask them a question. He said, that way you get them talking to each other for a second, and then you can kind of look around and get your sea legs about you. And the question I asked was, he said, just ask them, what are they doing there? What do you think that a college education is for? Because it really causes quite a bit of confusion in the first few minutes I've noticed for the past 10 years. And I'm always curious to pick.
That's a deep question.
Yeah.
And, well, I think for it, I'm going to vamp a little bit and say that it probably means different things to different people. But I think at its root, a college education is for finding a way to make yourself more than what you are, and to fully discover your own capacity for ongoing growth throughout your life. I don't know how I could answer that any differently and still say that I'm a proponent of lifelong learning. Which is what drew me to the community college in the first place.
When I was growing up, I'm sure you're familiar with Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused.
Sure.
And there's that scene where school's out for the summer.
Right.
Alice Cooper's blaring. And I remember being in high school when that movie came out, or when I saw the movie, and it reminded me very much of how I felt about school. It was like, man, I'm done with chemistry. Thank God to sell that book back. I just got $25. What am I going to do with these $25? As opposed to, I'm inspired to know more about chemistry, or it's interesting how little I know about my own biochemistry. There was very little for me inspiration to learn more independently in the future. And I always thought to myself as a teacher that if school's out for the summer and a student leaves my class and they're done with speech, they're finished giving their last speech, or students, in your case, I don't ever have to study, thank God I'm done with history. There's lots of students that are like that. Then I've failed them, even if they made an A in my class. And so, how do you feel about inspiring future independent learning, and how do you can you think of an example of when you've made that connection?
Maybe you'll end up agreeing with this, maybe not. But I tell my students, and maybe my fellow historians shouldn't hear this, or maybe they should, I don't know. But what I always tell my students, at some point, I don't know if it's the first day, but sometime in History 1301, I explained to them that I'm less interested in their ability to memorize facts, or can you recite the presidents in order, or Abraham Lincoln was president number 16, or whatever it might be. Because when it comes to facts, we can Google that. All right. But what I try to explain to them is that what I'm really interested in them learning is the capacity for critical thinking. And I always go back, and very few of them have read Ernest Hemingway, and we can certainly discuss Hemingway's misogyny and the simplicity of his writing and all of that. But when I read him deeply in graduate school in a couple of different literature courses, Hemingway had written about what you have to do to be a good writer. And he said one skill that's indispensable for being a good writer, and I guess we can bleep this out if we need to, but he said you need to have a built-in shock-proof shit detector.
Yeah.
Because if you can't, essentially what he's saying is if you can't identify bullshit, then you can't write believable fiction. Okay, and so that always stuck with me, and to me that's a useful metaphor for having critical thinking skills, is the ability to identify when someone is trying to bullshit you. And that is useful if and when you're a consumer looking to make major or even minor purchases. It's useful for considering more broadly one's place within society and culture and economy. And it's useful for dealing in individual human relationships. If you can understand when someone's bullshitting you, then you have that's sort of a foundation of that's what critical thinking is. Yeah. I guess I'd be honored if some of my students end up deciding to study history further and become history teachers or history professors later on, but I'm much more interested in them becoming capable, productive citizens, citizens of planet Earth, who are capable of thinking critically.
Yeah. And understanding the importance of looking back.
Sure.
And
right.
One of the lessons that didn't really come across for me as intuitively as it probably did for maybe others was when I was going through school. There were plenty of meta moments. I had plenty of people telling me these are the best years of your life. Like I got a lot of advice from a lot of older people when I was younger. And I certainly, when you hear something patternized, doesn't mean it's right, but there's probably something to it. So save your money was one.
Sure.
And these are the best years of your life. Wait till college or high school. And so I remember not necessarily feeling that way, but thinking that I better be feeling that way. I better be looking for
there
things
was pressure
to
it, sure.
There's something to this.
You're talking about like in high school or in college?
Man.
Or,
I mean, like even growing up like elementary school. Like so I grew up single mom, and so there's I think when you're around sports and that type of stuff, there's a lot of the dads that'll try to give you advice. You know what I mean? And so I certainly probably got a healthy dose of it coming from a wide variety of perspectives. Like, let me tell you how the world really is. And so the bullshit detector thing is something that I've certainly heard as I was growing up. But so
you got a lot of mansplaining, a lot of unsolicited mansplaining.
And womansplaining. Like I said, single mom. So yes, both. Yeah, I learned that goes both ways for sure. But the reason I bring that up is as a result of hearing a lot of that stuff, what I assumed is that by experiencing something or having gotten older, that you just become wiser. And I learned later that it's learning the right lesson. It's learning lessons from those mistakes that begets wisdom. I'm sorry, learning lessons from those mistakes begets wisdom. But even that doesn't quite cover it, because it's like you still can learn the wrong lesson from a mistake.
Right.
You need to learn the quote-unquote right lesson.
Right.
And what's right versus wrong? Well, that's a philosophical question, which leads you to another discipline. I guess with all of that, what I'm trying to get at is history seems to subsume so much of that. Like, it must be a treat to teach, to have that academic freedom to be able to have students enjoy looking back and to truly spend a lifetime with those, they've been in their own heads.
Sure.
Just
learn
from mistakes.
Well, as an undergrad, and I don't talk too much about as the camera goes tumbling.
Yeah, we don't need
You said you wanted to dump. That's a
Oh, sweet,
perfect
it's
dump
still
right
going,
there.
man.
Okay.
It'd be totally granola style.
As you
Anyways,
balance it on a box of
on a box of
Ritz
Ritz.
crackers. All
Hey, man,
right.
this has to start somewhere. Bring it. What are you saying?
Um, I talk a lot more about my community college experiences because I grew up on a community college campus. But at my 4-year school, when I was actually taking, junior and senior level history courses, I took a historiography course, and for the uninitiated, historiography is basically the study of how history is written.
Okay.
Okay, so and how the study, a lot of times the term revisionist history is sort of thrown out there as a pejorative, and really to a historian, we are constantly revising our understanding of history based on information that is new to us.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example. We used to think that, or the prevailing theory was that the first humans in the Americas came across the land bridge from Siberia to Alaska, 10 to 12,000 years ago. But just within the past couple of years, there's an island just off the coast of British Columbia, quite a bit further south from Alaska, where some anthropologists found some remains of a campsite where animals had been cooked and
Mhm.
obviously consumed by what appeared to be humanoids.
Right.
Okay, and they carbon dated the ashes and the fossilized bones in this area, and they carbon dated them to 14,000 years ago. So just in the past couple of years, our understanding or our theories about how and when humans came to the Americas has undergone some revision.
Yeah.
That's revisionist history.
Exactly.
As new information comes to us from not just historical investigation done by historians, but by specialists in other fields, anthropologists, archaeologists, scientists, chemists, biologists. As new information becomes available to us, or we rediscover new records, letters written by people. Another such example is we've learned that Eleanor Roosevelt had a lesbian lover. And we learned that because what was found was a treasure trove of love letters written between her and another woman whose at the moment name escapes me, but throughout the 3+ terms of her husband Franklin Roosevelt as president, she carried on sort of a long distance romance with a woman.
Yeah.
And, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah.
That we learned that. So now we know that Eleanor Roosevelt was apparently bisexual.
Yeah.
It has complicated our understanding of Eleanor Roosevelt, but I think in a very cool way. And that's revisionist history, and that's not anything pejorative at all. And so the opportunity, back to your point, the opportunity to draw from other disciplines, and as I learned in this historiography course, that everything that has happened up until this point is part of history.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so we do have the ability to draw from knowledge gained, knowledge developed, knowledge rediscovered from other disciplines.
I'm reminded of the Mark Twain quote: "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And so, what
Sure.
patterns are you noticing today? There's another quote that I think it gets attributed to lots of people, of course, because most of these things are echoed throughout philosophy. But is that a couple of them. One, history is written by the
Victors,
right?
yeah.
Journalism is the first draft of history,
Right.
and the other one is those who don't study their own history are doomed to repeat
Right.
mistakes from it. You want to grab a hold of any one of those because they all kind of get at the same sort of thing here. And how does that play out in your experiences with just reading what students write? Whatever you're trying to get out of them. Obviously, you have a philosophy that going forward of what you want them to do with critical thinking skills. But
Sure.
what do you draw from, or can you think of an example from teaching that's sort of emblematic of someone understanding that?
Sure.
At a young age?
I want my students to understand that however modest they think their backgrounds are, they and their parents and their ancestors are historical actors. Now, have they all attained grand heights and high office and All of that, no, but they have been part of shaping history. I'm developing a new course right now. I'll offer in the second 8 weeks. It's a history of Texas class, but it's centered on immigration, and the idea that unless you're descendant from 100% Pima Indians, that ultimately all of us here living in Texas have descended from people who immigrated to Texas. And maybe it happened within our own lifetime. I know for me, I moved to Texas. So I'm an immigrant here. So the idea is, although it's phrased as a question, it's like, are we in Texas? Are we all immigrants? Well, I think the answer is yes. One of the anecdotes I like to get in to try to understand, to try to bring the high down low. Okay. I talk about sort of my own distant family history, and I go into the fact that I sort of set my students up and said, "Did you know?" Or you're in the presence of royalty. Like you're now learning a class from someone who's related to both Barack Obama and George W. Bush. What? Well, Obama on his mother's side, but Obama and Bush have a common ancestor who's a Hinckley, and this Sarah Hinckley had 3 sons who. 6 turned 35, came over to Plymouth, Barnstable, which is now part of Massachusetts. And so I tell them that. I say that, and this is all documented by another Hinckley's who's distantly related to my dad. And I say, lest you think that makes us royalty. And I go off on a side and I say sometimes the work of historians is done not by legitimate's the wrong word, not by credentialed trained historians, but a few years ago, it was learned that, and this was when Obama was still president, we didn't yet know Trump would be occupying that office. But it was learned that actually, if you go back far enough, every U.S. president except for Martin Van Buren all share a common ancestor. We're keeping it in the family, all right? Well, the common ancestor is King John of England, Magna Carta 1215, who was so unsuccessful as a king that he had to give up the powers of unlimited monarchy and sign the Magna Carta, giving away powers to the nobles in order to tax to fund the ongoing wars, including the Crusades. So no king since King John has taken the name John, because the name John in England is shamed now for royalty because King John gave away the powers of unlimited monarchy. And I said, and now his descendants have continuously bumbled and stumbled into, leading the United States. And so I say, so ultimately, I guess a lot of us can trace back lineage to King John, but that, King John was obviously a pretty terrible failure as a king when you think about it, even though the Magna Carta is an amazing advancement in the ongoing pursuit of further rights, human rights. Even though its conception of rights was much more limited, it was talking about property rights and that sort of thing. But and then I go back to the 1630s and I talk about how it was actually there was a Hinckley who was the governor of Plymouth Colony, and I said, but he was the last governor of Plymouth Colony. And I said, think about that. Plymouth Colony ceased to exist under my ancestors' leadership. He was such a horrible leader that Plymouth needed to be bailed out by Massachusetts to become part of Massachusetts. So how much of a disaster was my ancestor as this governor of Plymouth Colony? So I said, I bring that up to share with my students that we all have skeletons in our ancestors' closets. We all have ancestors that screwed up. Some of our ancestors enslaved other human beings. Some of our ancestors killed Native Americans. Some of our ancestors were, committed domestic violence. Some of our ancestors did this awful thing or that awful thing. And we're not responsible for what our ancestors did. But we are responsible for learning from their mistakes, making ourselves better humans by not repeating those mistakes.
Yeah, in the sense that it's interesting, we have no control over what they did. Zero. We have control over how we respond to our
Mm-hmm.
current
Mm-hmm.
environment,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it takes a carefully threaded needle for me of both formal and informal education to have people at the table who have experience to weigh in on, so that we do get a better, clearer picture of the lessons we're supposed to learn
Right.
from history. Because again, you can learn the wrong lessons, and that doesn't necessarily put you in a better spot. Couple things I want to ask before we just kind of close up, just for the sake of time. But
I'm just making sure this is a recording, and it looks like it's good.
oh, is
So,
that what that? Oh,
yeah,
yeah, my bad. I
yeah.
must call my bad. But yeah, I do want to pick your brain about a few things, because it's fascinating. One of the things that, and I had a sense that you were doing this and that my colleagues are doing this, but outside of teaching squares, which is again, for the uninitiated, those that may come across this, teaching squares is like where you have four teachers, i.e., a square, learning from each other by visiting each other's classes.
Right.
And I didn't realize when I first got involved with that program, it was just it was created by another institution. I'm blanking on at the time at the moment, but I didn't realize how private a lot of teachers are with their classrooms. You know, some teach with their
Mhm.
doors open, some you can hear them out with the door closed, but it's almost like when you want to walk in that class, it's like, whoa, not without an invitation, you don't.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is when I got a chance to peek in, there was like 80 of us that participated, so it was a healthy number of full-time
Right.
faculty. Let's be real. So there was a lot of people that were interested, but I got a sense of what I'd assumed by visiting classes, in that there's writing across the curriculum, but also the explanation that you just gave of your or the analysis of your family's history there, using those two time periods, shows that you're obviously blending biology with history, because you have to these
Mm-hmm.
days, right?
Mm-hmm.
What, to someone who doesn't have, when you stumble over the word legitimate, I know when you when you use the other word, what was the other word?
Credentialed.
Credentialed. How do you feel about? Because I don't know these days how you teach history without touching biology. I don't know how a person would teach philosophy without talking about government at some point, or teach government without touching on, who we are as human beings. Again, back to
Right.
biology.
Sure.
It seems like all of these nodes need to be hit along the way if we're doing cross-curricular.
We can't be hanging out in our silos.
So where is do you see a bright line between expertise and being an expert? Like someone who just knows more than the average person about something that they're not credentialed in, but they know quite a bit about it. How much academic freedom do you think instructors should have
Oh,
when it
wow.
comes to that type of stuff? And where do you defer? Where does one defer?
I don't know if I can answer that philosophically. I can sort of walk through it concretely.
Yeah,
Um,
that's much better, probably.
But and the example that always comes to me is again, historiography, how the study of history has changed over time based on interpretive frameworks, based on information becoming newly rediscovered and available to us. One of the dominant interpretations of the Civil War for a long time, that still actually, like a virus, infects teaching of the Civil War in today's elementary and secondary schools in Texas, is that slavery was just one of many causes. And of course, the way I teach it is that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War. And almost all credentialed professional historians today accept that interpretation, and the overwhelming preponderance of evidence from that time, including leaders of the Confederacy at the time, were very explicit about their ongoing preservation of the institution and system of slavery as being their chief concern, which led to their secession and rebellion against the federal government. So it's the dominant accepted historical framework today. We've had a number of adjuncts in our department who were still teaching what basically is the interpretation that the Texas Education Agency, for political reasons, continues to insist be taught in grade schools and high schools in Texas, which is that again saying that slavery was not the central cause, but just one of many causes. And although I haven't participated in this, it's my understanding that at least a couple of our adjuncts have been let go, and that has been part of the reason that they're basically teaching wrong history. And we have a responsibility to 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 teach the right history, to teach, and that's too strong of a statement, but right history, wrong history, not that. But the idea
It's
that
philosophical now.
it is philosophical, but the
Yeah.
idea that
Good.
there are stories that are told that are not historically accurate, that are not in keeping with the overwhelming preponderance of the documents that are available.
Right.
Okay. Um, so you're talking about academic freedom and freedom of speech and all of that. I guess you could put it into something a little bit less esoteric. Maybe something, well, and maybe it's esoteric in a different way. But does academic freedom mean that an instructor of biology at a college has the right to teach creationism?
Hmm.
Is it, or does the institution and or the faculty in that department have a responsibility to ensure that scientifically accurate information is being taught?
Yeah, and who do we want to be the stewards of what's accurate? Period.
Right.
Whether it's scientifically or philosophically, and well, that's as I recall from my history classes, that is the job of an informed populace. That's the herd immunity against having
Right.
people in those types of
Right.
positions that are of consequence.
Mhm.
Because I think there's a famous astrophysicist that he's become a part of the podcast culture. So many people, young people especially, know him, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he
Sure.
always says that if you want to believe those things, that's fine. If you want to, there's nothing wrong with teaching people that, but not if you're in a publicly funded institution, right? This is we're providing a public good service, education, and to be on the right side of history is certainly a philosophical question, but to be on the factual side is certainly another. There's a difference
Right.
between facts, beliefs, and values.
Right.
When you say the right to teach that in a history class, well, certainly to the extent that you can't be let out of the class in handcuffs.
Correct.
So yeah, but as far as whether or not the sort of the de facto board that keeps that signs that person's contract
Sure.
wants to renew it, well, if anyone's taking it is a weird spot, because it's like, what is the right academic freedom that one can take? But I guess that's where student learning outcomes that are specifically defined help, because then it's like, however you want to get to this,
Right.
fine.
Sure. Yeah.
There's lots of different ways to get to this. But one of the things I want to ask you about is the Catholic Church since we're on creationism, the Catholic Church in the 1500s. I'm not a date geek. I'm really bad at dates. But in the 1500s, I believe, started the position devil's advocate, diabolus advocatus, and the idea was to have someone to challenge the proposition of sainthood of people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so just to have someone to play devil's advocate.
I didn't realize the origin of that term. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Now this is cursory, an unambitious Google search, but this is a bit of a cursory read here. But my understanding of it was, as I read it, was that it really was to find the skeletons in these people's closets.
Sure.
Because you don't want to put someone up for sainthood that turns out to be a monster later on, right? And not that there's anything funny about monstrousness, but nonetheless, monstrosity. But I love it, because I tell students all the time that my job this semester will be to disagree with you. So offer up an argument in opposition to the one that you pose. I don't care what it is. I'm doing it for the intellectual exercise. And as a result, they don't have any idea where I bend when it comes to my politics. It's none of their business. You know, I mean, it is in the sense that we're all humans, but when I'm in that classroom, I feel like from a philosophical standpoint, it's always good to offer up a counterpoint. How do you look at that when it comes to um, presenting ideas to students so that with the expectation that they're supposed to find holes in it, like welcoming challenges, I guess, at the front of the classroom, the sage on
Well,
stage versus
well,
the
and
guy
what's
side.
the role of dissent? I know you're a big fan of Noam Chomsky.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, so what's the role of dissent, and how should we regard the dissident?
Yes. Principled dissident.
Right. Um, you know, there's a couple different ways to look at that, and number one, I think one who dissents. I think along with freedom comes responsibility.
Yeah,
All
definitely.
right, and so I think the dissident sort of has a responsibility to be speaking from an area of deep expertise and deep study, and it's when a dissident critic of an established orthodoxy speaks, writes, publishes with um, not just the skins on the wall, but having done the research and having really looked into it, that oftentimes a new interpretive framework, a new interpretation, a new um, antithesis to the
Mhm.
established thesis, sometimes it
Yeah.
does take over, and that's what happens in historiography. Um, I'm maybe a little less charitable to the uninformed dissident. And maybe that's too harsh a term, but sitting in this podcast studio here reminds me of an anecdote when I was up at Richland, and we were starting up a web radio station there, and
Yeah.
there was a student who, um,
Shout out to Richland.
we both did our time there.
Yeah.
This student, well-meaning and well-intentioned, and had a certain knowledge. He wanted an air shift, an hour a week, in which he wanted to preach in Hebrew.
Interesting.
Okay, and this triggered some debate within our department, and I was one of the staff members slash low level administrators who had to sort of help make a decision here, or at least help our student station manager come to a decision. And and this wasn't terribly long after 9/11,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of still to this day. I mean, I guess you find it in our culture as well, but there was a lot of inflammatory rhetoric um, in and around religions, especially the the major Western religions, Judaism and Christianity and Muslim, Islam.
The Abrahamic tradition.
Sure, yeah, that I should know that term, and I wasn't occurring to me. Um, and what we finally and he said, what about my rights? Oh, so what we said was, okay, if you want to have this air shift and essentially do your show in Hebrew,
Mhm.
which is, although there are some people who speak that at Richland and some people in Dallas County, we don't have any way of knowing. Our students as station managers who do have sort of the responsibility for editorial control over the student media outlet don't have the ability to have any sort of sense of what it is that you're saying because they don't speak Hebrew.
Right.
So we said, if you can find someone who knows Hebrew who is willing to produce a transcript of your show so that student station management can review what it is that you're saying and making sure that you're not saying anything that could be inflammatory. And keep in mind, I'm just remembering this now, our student-run radio station was mere feet from the meditation room on campus, which was
I remember
being
that
used
place.
by a lot of Muslim students.
Okay.
Okay, so
For call for prayer.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
okay,
definitely.
and so what's going through our mind is, are we going to have a situation here where we have West Bank, Gaza Strip violence break out right in front of our student media
Yeah.
newsroom?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't know, and without a transcript in English of what he's speaking in Hebrew, how can we know? And he found a professor of Hebrew at Brookhaven College, interestingly, but I think he was an adjunct. He said, "Listen, transcribing an hour-long show, that's a many hours process, and I
Yeah.
don't have the money to do that." And so this student wanted the district to pay for that transcription, and it sort of finally broke down. And we said, listen, he says, well, what about my First Amendment rights? I have the right to speak. And we said, absolutely, you have the right to speak. But our students who have been entrusted in station management and editorial control for this student media outlet don't have the responsibility to give you a microphone platform.
Understood. Yeah.
So his was, and I knew this student because he was also expressing other I would call uninformed dissident opinions, including riling other people up. So we kind of knew where he was going just from his other behaviors. So I'm a little less charitable to the dissent of the uninformed, or those who are just parroting sort of ideological talking points.
What about the idea that a person should be given a platform, that a spotlight should be put on ideas that are maybe right-hearted but wrong-headed, maybe wrong-hearted and wrong-headed, but the idea that we need to put that ideas when they, regardless of who they come from, obviously they can come from any political existential bent.
Sure.
Someone can end up on the wrong side of logic at some point with respect to anything, but with how much rope do you give someone to hang themselves, essentially? And you know, and I mean that, of course, because we have so many examples where if you let a person talk long enough, you get a sense very quickly that if you reverse engineer the logic, that they might actually have all the right facts together, but they're just drawing batshit conclusions from those facts. Mm-hmm. And we discover, oh, well, then here's our point of disagreement, and we can actually fix this.
Right.
As opposed to demonizing or silencing altogether those, and not giving those people a platform to say what they want to say, and trusting in the populace to think critically as we
mm-hmm.
want them to, ideally. But this is ideal, and there's practical, right?
Right.
And so
sure.
It sounds like, I know that you certainly have you and I have had discussions about politics, and people like Chomsky will come up, and
mm-hmm.
As far as like, you've described yourself, I think, before as an anarcho-syndicalist.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand nuance, and I don't mean that in an asshole way, I promise. That sounds elitist, but myself included, I had no idea what it meant until I came across the term.
I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it means.
Sure. I mean, but we want to think about, I'm not just this. I'm not just a Republican. I'm not just a Democrat. I'm more than that. And people, they look for something that sort of hits that. How much freedom do you think we should give people to, you're only as good as your last sentence. You have the right to destroy your reputation publicly if you wish.
Right.
How much do you believe in that? Like, let's put a microscope under it, as opposed to shooing away ideas that are uninformed. Crowdsource it.
I don't know that you don't throw someone in jail.
Sure.
For expressing even an uninformed dissident opinion or idea, or even doing so voluminously.
Right.
Okay. And if someone wants, I guess, to push the metaphor further, how much rope do you give them? I find that people who are willing to go that far, I guess, eventually are going to sort of take the rope. Mm-hmm. Whether they're given it or not. I think those of us, like for instance in the classroom, if all of a sudden we had a student that wanted to pontificate and wouldn't stop, would we let them filibuster for a full 80-minute class?
That's true.
We probably wouldn't. We would find a way that feels least bad as possible to try to rein it in. And so that other students' learning isn't hijacked.
Sure.
Okay. I think of the movie The Blues Brothers. Fairly early in the film, where they're driving through the park in Chicago, and it's the Illinois Nazis who are protesting. I hate Illinois Nazis, Jake Blues says, and then drives them off into jumping into the creek. should they have the right to protest, to organize a rally, even potentially in a public place? Yeah, I think so. As long as they're not inciting people to imminent violence.
Yeah.
But I don't think that we have to give them the freedom of speech does not go so far as to say, okay, we're going to let you interrupt other students who are wanting to learn in the classroom.
Definitely.
There has to be balancing one person or one group's rights to speak versus the rights of others to be able to listen and to other things. That's why, and that's where the idea of like values and norms and mores and customs
Yep.
comes in. Like somebody certainly on the DART train or on the bus or whatever has a right to speak, but once they get up to a certain level, um, people are going to tell a DART officer, hey, tell this person they're
They don't have the right to disturb someone else's peace, essentially. I mean,
Right.
There's laws against that. It's
Right.
a weird. It's almost purposefully vague.
I think
that,
so.
That line
Yes.
between, and it's almost like we have to negotiate this generationally
right
because technology has changed things.
and repeatedly.
And repeatedly.
Yes.
We have to come back to it. And
Right.
it's like, again, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and so we can see a lot of these things coming. They say hindsight's 20/20.
Right.
I think quite often so too is foresight. Especially as I've gotten older, I can see myself making stupid mistakes. And to the idea of, if anyone happens to listen to this in the future, and I do think we have interested colleagues, interested enough to sit and have these types of discussions, and not just at happy hour, but in
Yeah.
in a studio like this, I want people to understand that, like, I'm wrong about lots of stuff, and I want, like, even if some things I say are uninformed, that I say it out loud in public because I want to be on record saying this is how I feel based on what I know so far.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to be wrong in the public square
Right.
for the sake of
Right.
learning. And you and I were talking right before we stepped in here, and there's a couple things I want to hit before we jet, is about just people's reticence, especially in an organization like ours, where we do have a lot of academic freedom, and there are a lot of people, once those doors close, that take it and say,
Right.
hey, I'm this is why I love what I do for a living.
Mhm.
But a lot of that feeling of the freedom of speech, and again, I'm using that as a fungible term, but it sort of stops short for many people once it comes to talking to supervisors and I
Or
don't-
even colleagues.
yeah, I certainly should. Yeah, I don't mean it to be combative in any way, and I just mean dissidence, principled,
Yeah.
shared
Yeah.
dissidence. Just, hey, I'm feeling really weird about this, or I'm feeling really weird about that, or there's something you said the other day that I have to disagree with, and I'm reminded of Dr. Well, we know her as Kim, Dr. Kim Chandler, and she mentioned at the Welcome Back meeting, she said, we need critical friends. And at the administration, and I really enjoyed that line because I've used it in my classes. It's like, I need critical friends.
Mm-hmm.
We all do. How do you feel about, I guess, there may be students listening to this at some point.
Right.
The healthy
Yeah.
number of students that we certainly have kept up with. How do you feel about encouraging younger people to do things like, I'm not saying this in our case, but like ask for a raise. You've been there for a year at Chicken Express. Like, I don't know, I'm waiting for them to come up to me. Just talking and communicating, opening those lines, creating inroads with people that are your superiors or your quote unquote equals, but i.e. colleagues, or even people that you may supervise.
Yeah. One of the things that has always appealed to me about working at a community college in particular, number one, I think, not to overdo this, but I really do believe this, that the community college is probably about the last best hope for democracy, for social democracy in the United States. And selfishly, there's a lot of cool people who work here, a lot of cool, smart people who work here who I want to hear from.
Cosign.
And that's selfish of me, but I think the larger point is that there is so much that we all can learn from one another just by willing to sit down and engage in a conversation. And our feelings going to get hurt sometimes, but I don't just want to have my orthodoxies affirmed. by my friends who I've self-selected because they believe the same things as me. I want to be challenged. That's why I enjoy working in an academic environment. That's what we're out to do, is to challenge prevailing orthodoxies, especially wrong orthodoxies, or bad orthodoxies, or orthodoxies that keep people trapped within whatever abusive or impoverished situations they find themselves or are born into.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can't do that. People from our family don't do that.
Yeah.
You know, people from. But what do you want to be? Do you think you're too good for us? You know, I want my students to be able to challenge politely,
Sure.
okay, but challenge their parents or family members who want to keep them down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I want all of our students to be able to succeed, and maybe it's not always financial. It's not always a matter of financial success. It often is.
Yeah.
Okay, if somebody is happy with a philosophy degree tending bar at a Chili's, you know what? That's fine. If that person's engaging in society and being productive, including by tending bar at a Chili's, but they can think about how they're voting and what their consumer decisions are, that's great. At the same time, for a lot of people, it is sort of financial. All right, and I want students not saddled with, $50,000 or $60,000 in debt
Mm-hmm.
because they've earned a degree that only qualifies them to make for a job that makes $30K a year.
Yeah.
We haven't done that student any favors
Mm-hmm.
if we've put them into that position. So, there's plenty of orthodoxies for us to be challenging, and part of the orthodoxies that we have are disciplinary. Okay, like within our own disciplines, we have a way of looking at the world or at knowledge within the filters of our own disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
We have institutional orthodoxies and silos that I think, as we move to single accreditation, we're going to have to find a way to break out of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
So I guess, coming back around, I want my own orthodoxies challenged. I've changed what I've taught every year, or every time I teach a new 1301 class or a new 1302 class, based on what I'm reading, and it's usually not from academic journals. It's usually from, this link turns up on my Twitter feed or my Facebook feed. In a field that I don't teach, in biology or philosophy or archaeology or anthropology or whatever. That forces me to or economics. It forces me to reconsider and teach differently something I taught previously. To me, that's what lifelong learning is all about. That's what we're here for, is inculcating this ongoing spirit of lifelong learning and challenging our own orthodoxies to continue to be, engaged human beings capable of critical thinking, including critically evaluating our role that we play in the systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The systems often of oppression that are out there.
Yeah, and sometimes that oppression is self-imposed. You can,
Absolutely.
it's a mind-forged manacle, and that can come from early.
Right.
What I guess childhood psychology helps with this. Like a lot of us can go back and see where a lot of our habits come from, the thought pattern, habits of thought, habits of behavior,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. And that helps because, again, you look back at your own personal history.
Yeah.
And you can learn from mistakes. One thing you said a second ago, or a bit ago, was about freedom being, with freedom comes responsibility. And of course, I'm always reminded of the Stan Lee line, with power comes great responsibility. And I
Right.
actually like the phrasing that you gave better, because freedom is power. If you give people freedom of this or freedom of that, you're saying that does not mean that, yes, if you have the right to go up to someone and say mean things to their face without fear of physical reprisal, that doesn't mean that you should. And the extent to which we have people going around making noises that legitimately hurt people's feelings is the extent to which we need to re-examine our culture rather than take away people's freedom of speech. And that's just kind of the philosophical bent I come from on the first
Right.
day, is I've created a safe space, safe enough for you to say whatever
Right.
you want. So, I want to end with this, man. I'll just put this bug in your ear and let you think about it. Art history was something that I had to take, or I took when I was in college, and I think it might have been on the required list or not. But it's a subset of what you teach. Obviously, it's a subgenre, and I didn't have the best experience. I wish I had, because I love art, and I didn't know how much I loved it until I got to be older and discovered YouTube. But I I remember the final exam, and the guy goes, "Bring in, we're gonna have a potluck, blah blah blah." And he just turned the lights off every day and did slideshows. And it was like, "And this is a cruciform, and these were found." And I was like, "Oh God!" It's like Ben Stein style. So I got through it, and he goes, "Bring 2 blue books." You remember those? Yeah. He goes, "Bring
Sure.
2 blue books," and he goes, "Just we have 2 hours together, and we'll do 30-minute. We'll do the first part of the class or exam, and the last part we'll feed you." So break out the blue books, and he's sitting there, and he shows a picture, and it showed a picture of a gallery, an art gallery. He goes, "I was in NYC last weekend," and he goes, "This is a gallery I went to." He was showing the pictures, and it's just your typical people standing around in wired rim glasses, looking,
dressed in all
things,
black,
dressed in all black,
turtlenecks. Yeah.
yes, and they, but they, there's velvet rope around this last slide, and it was an unflushed toilet. And I'll just use your imagination. And everybody just kind of looked back and was like, "What?" And he goes, "Okay, now." And there's people standing around with clipboards, looking, talking, and it's just like it was a normal thing. And he goes, "Is this art?" And that's the little caption that dropped down that appeared. He goes, "You have 30 minutes, go." And so we sat there, and everyone's writing. And, it took me a second to figure out whatever. And then he goes, "Okay, the last few seconds, put your pens down." Everyone's finishing up their final thoughts. And he goes, "Okay," and we're thinking party. And he goes, "All right, now take out the second blue book." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I got a second one." He goes, "Now, argue for the opposite position. And if you can't, then argue about why you can't argue for the opposite position." Now, I put that bug in your ear just because I'll never forget that final exam, even though the class itself I probably would have forgotten. But it taught me a lot of what you said, at the beginning of this, that you really want students to walk away with, which is the importance of critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
Nuance. I can watch The Joker and look at layers within the layers. It's sort of like a thorough way of coming at anything that you encounter.
Right.
But like you said, everything's history, because everything happened a second ago, at least. So you can learn to see the tree within the tree if you have the right set of or the right kind of vision.
Right.
I think that's what teachers are supposed to provide. It takes a village. It's not just us.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's really cool that you're a part of it. So anything you want to say on the way out, Matt?
That your art history class reminded me of. So, as a kid, my parents always listened to news radio, and we had a legitimate news station in Chicago.
Okay.
Not this sort of pseudo faux news that we have down here. It was a legitimate news organization on the radio. Always listened to that in the car, probably because I didn't want my sisters and I, exposed to George Michael and other kinds of stuff on the radio.
First tape. We had Stevens and Pruitt, I remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we always watched the news at night, and it was the Chicago news, and I remembered very distinctly. In 1983, Chicago elected its first African American mayor. He served a full term, was reelected. His tenure was extremely controversial only because he and his political organization were sort of challenging a lot of the orthodoxies in the city, including racial orthodoxies. Yeah. All right, and he was reelected, and then he passed away shortly into his second full term. Now the main library in Chicago is named after him, the Harold Washington Public Library. I don't remember if this was while he was still mayor or after his sudden death, but an artist, no doubt a desiring to be provocative, did a painting of Harold Washington, depicted nude, except for wearing some lingerie or some women's panties or something. Mm-hmm. Okay, and this was on display. I don't know if it was the Chicago Art Institute or if it was a smaller gallery somewhere in the city, but in a big event that was broadcast. I don't know if it was live on the news, but there were certainly cameras there, and this was shown on the news later. A leader of the African American political establishment, I don't remember who it was, walked into this gallery and removed the painting. Censored the painting, And I don't know if the painting was returned or if it was ever put back up in the gallery, but it was just this. And I don't remember exactly how old I was. It was sometime in the mid to late '80s, but I remember like at that moment it was like a lightning bolt of conflict between pure freedom of expression and yet also sensitivity to um, the needs and concerns of a historically underrepresented and oppressed minority within the city. And it's like, how do you come down on an issue like that? I don't know that there's any absolutist position that fits that type of thing. But I think only through ongoing dialogue, can we at least begin to try to approach an answer or an understanding of it. So I'm glad you're doing this podcast, and I'm
Hey, man.
happy to have been a part of it here.
Everybody to do it. Long live the argument, sir.
I hope so.
Cool, man. All right.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.